Guam is not simply an island. It is a geometric fact. Positioned at the western edge of the first island chain's gap, 1,500 nautical miles from the Chinese mainland coast and 1,500 nautical miles from the Japanese home islands, it occupies a piece of the Pacific that military planners on every side of every relevant calculation have been studying since the Second World War, with the focused attention of people who understand that geography, at this scale, is destiny. Andersen Air Force Base on Guam's northern plateau is one of the longest runways in the United States military inventory. The port at Apra Harbor hosts nuclear-capable submarine assets and logistics infrastructure that supports operations across the entire Western Pacific theater. The island is what strategists call a power projection node, a place from which things can be reached that cannot easily be reached from anywhere else. It is also, for exactly those reasons, the most studied target in the People's Liberation Army Air Force's Operational Planning Library. At 4:33 a.m., the E-3 Sentry AWACS aircraft that had been orbiting 300 miles east of the Philippine Sea on a standard surveillance track acquired two large radar contacts at the extreme edge of its effective detection range, bearing 261, altitude 32,000 feet, speed approximately 490 knots. The contacts were at the margin of characterization confidence at that range, but the combination of size, speed, altitude, and bearing was consistent with one specific category of aircraft, the H-6K strategic bomber, the People's Liberation Army Air Force's primary long-range strike platform, an aircraft whose operational range and cruise missile payload capability had made it the subject of consistent and detailed intelligence attention since it entered service, and whose presence at this bearing and altitude at 4:33 a.m. in the morning was not, by any analytical framework available to the E-3 crew, consistent with a routine navigation training flight. The AWACS combat control officer had the contacts on his display for 41 seconds before he transmitted the first report. 41 seconds of accumulating track data, refining the characterization confidence, watching the contacts heading, resolved toward a bearing that, when extended to its logical conclusion, placed Guam at the end of a straight line drawn through 4:33 a.m.'s contact position. He transmitted at 4:34 a.m. and 9 seconds, and the transmission activated a response chain that had been specifically designed and rehearsed for exactly this contact profile. Andersen Air Force Base's alert protocol activated at 4:34 a.m. and 31 seconds. The two F-22 Raptors on 5-minute alert in the alert facility adjacent to the base's primary taxiway had crews in their cockpits at 4:34 a.m. and 44 seconds, 13 seconds after the alert activation, a response time that reflected both the crew's professionalism and the specific operational context of a base that had been living with an elevated alert posture for the past 72 hours, following a series of intelligence indicators that the PACOM intelligence staff had characterized as consistent with the Chinese military readiness elevation in the Western Pacific. 72 hours of elevated alert. Two crews who had been sleeping in the alert facility, fully equipped, within 45 seconds of their aircraft. They were ready because the intelligence community had given them a reason to be ready, and because readiness, at this level, required exactly the kind of sustained operational discipline that could not be improvised on the morning it became necessary. The first F-22A was airborne at 4:37 a.m. and 12 seconds. The second at 4:37 a.m. and 29 seconds. Both aircraft climbed immediately to intercept altitude, their AN/APG-77 AESA radars operating in the low probability of intercept modes that were among the Raptor's most operationally significant capabilities. Modes in which the radar swept the airspace with sufficient power and precision to build a detailed track picture while emitting at signal levels that Chinese radar warning receivers operating at the expected intercept range were unlikely to characterize as active radar illumination. The F-22 could see without being seen as seeing. The AWACS was painting the two H-6K contacts with complete fidelity at 4:37 a.m., feeding the track data through its data link to the climbing Raptors in real time. The contacts were at 281 nautical miles from Andersen, maintaining their heading and altitude, speed now refined to 495 knots. At that speed and heading, they would reach the 200 nautical mile mark, the outer boundary of Guam's integrated air defense system's primary engagement envelope, in approximately 34 minutes. 34 minutes. The F-22s would reach intercept geometry in approximately 19 minutes at their current climb rate and intercept vector. 15 minutes of margin between the Raptors achieving intercept and the H-6Ks reaching the outer engagement boundary. Assuming both maintained their current profiles, the flight lead was computing the intercept geometry from the AWACS data link picture while climbing through 28,000 feet. He was also computing something else. The H-6K's external stores configuration was not visible from 281 nautical miles on any sensor available to him at this moment. The intelligence assessment for H-6K operations against Guam had characterized the platform's primary long-range strike weapon as the CJ-20 air-launched cruise missile, a weapon with an assessed range of 1,500 to 2,000 kilometers that allowed the H-6K to release its payload from a standoff position well outside the integrated air defense system's engagement envelope and return to its base without entering the defended zone. If the H-6Ks were carrying CJ-20S in an operational strike configuration, the 200 nautical mile outer boundary was not the relevant tactical threshold. The relevant threshold was the CJ-20's maximum release range, which, if the higher range assessment was correct, meant the missiles could be released from their current position or at any point in the next 90 nautical miles of approach. The H-6Ks could already be inside their release envelope. The flight lead transmitted this assessment to the AWACS and to Andersen's Air Defense Command at 4:38 a.m. He did not phrase it as analysis. He stated it as a tactical fact that the engagement planning needed to account for. The H-6K's current position was potentially inside their maximum weapons release range, and the intercept needed to achieve visual identification and threat deterrence before the H-6Ks reached whatever release point their mission plan had designated, which might be before the Raptors reached them at the geometry the current intercept vector was building toward. Andersen Air Force Base's Air Defense Commander transmitted the recognition of the problem and the authorization for the F-22s to accelerate their intercept to maximum continuous power at 4:39 a.m. The Raptors were already at military power. The authorization for maximum continuous power represented the decision to accept the increased fuel burn and reduced on-station endurance in exchange for the earlier intercept geometry that the situation's timeline required. Both F-22s pushed their throttles to maximum continuous at 4:39 a.m. and 7 seconds. At 4:41 a.m., the AWACS refined its characterization of the two H-6K contacts and transmitted an update that changed the intercept picture in a direction that the flight lead had assessed as possible, and that the Air Defense Commander in Andersen had been monitoring the intelligence feed for evidence of since the contacts first appeared. The contacts were not two aircraft. The AWACS's refined track picture, working with additional radar sweeps that had accumulated since the initial detection, was now resolving a third contact. Smaller, at a different altitude, on a slightly offset bearing that had been masked by the larger H-6K returns at maximum detection range. A third aircraft. Not a bomber. The radar cross-section was smaller and the speed slightly higher than the H-6Ks, consistent with a fighter or strike aircraft in the escort role. The characterization confidence was 71% at this range, which the AWACS operator noted, and the flight lead logged, and both of them treated as 100% for planning purposes, because in the specific operational context of Chinese H-6K bombers approaching Guam in the pre-dawn hours, a 71% confidence assessment of an escort aircraft was not a number that justified planning for its absence. 3 contacts. 2 bombers. 1 escort. The escort was positioned aft of the bombers and slightly north, a formation geometry consistent with covering the bombers 6 o'clock from an intercept coming from the south or southeast, which was the bearing the Andersen alert section was approaching from. The escort knew, or had been briefed to expect, the bearing from which the intercept would come. The flight lead adjusted his intercept vector at 4:41 a.m. and 33 seconds, climbing above the planned intercept altitude to approach the formation from a geometry that placed him above and to the north of the formation's axis, a position that took him away from the escort's anticipated threat coverage sector and toward the bomber's forward quarter from an angle that the escort's positioning was not optimized to address. The adjustment added approximately 3 minutes to the intercept timeline. He accepted the cost. His wingman held the original intercept bearing as a secondary approach, not closing at the same rate but present on the escort's primary threat bearing, requiring the escort crew's attention and sensor resources without committing to the geometry that the escort had been positioned to contest. The F-22's APG-77 resolved all 3 contacts at 4:43 a.m. at a range of 88 nautical miles. The radar picture was clean and detailed. 2 H-6K returns with the large, distinctive radar cross-section of 4 engine strategic bombers at cruise altitude, and behind them the smaller, faster return of the escort aircraft. The escort's cross-section profile at 88 nautical miles was consistent with a Sukhoi 30 or J-16 variant, a capable, long-range twin-engine multi-role aircraft with a radar and weapons suite that made it a serious tactical factor rather than a nominal presence. At 88 nautical miles, the flight lead had a complete tactical picture and a weapons solution on every contact in the formation. He had not illuminated any fire control radar. He had not transmitted in any mode that the contact's own warning receivers were likely to have resolved as a targeting band emission. The Raptors' LPY radar was doing its designed work, building a detailed picture from which weapons could have been employed if they had been authorized, without informing the target formation that the picture existed. The formation did not know the F-22 was there. At 4:44 a.m., the lead H-6K made the first transmission of the engagement on the military air traffic control frequency that Chinese military aircraft used for long-range operations. The transmission was in Mandarin. The AWACS language specialist characterized it immediately. A routine position report, transmitted to an unidentified ground control station, stating the formation's current position, heading, speed, and altitude. A position report of the kind that flight crews transmitted to their ground control as standard navigation procedure. Nothing in the language of the transmission suggested awareness of the F-22 intercept that was 15 minutes from achieving visual range. The transmission told the flight lead 2 things. The first was that the formation was in communication with a ground station that was tracking the mission in real time. The second was that the ground station's picture, whatever it contained about the tactical situation around the H-6Ks, had not led to any notification to the bomber crews that they were being intercepted. Either the ground station did not have the F-22s on its picture, or it had them and had chosen not to inform the crews, or it had them, and the information was being transmitted through a channel the AWACS language specialist had not monitored. 3 possibilities. All 3 operationally relevant. None resolvable from the available data. At 4:46 a.m., the escort aircraft altered its position within the formation. It moved forward, closing the distance between itself and the bombers, repositioning from its 6 o'clock coverage station to a position between the bombers and the bearing from which the primary intercept approach had originally been computed. The repositioning was not dramatic. It was 4.2 nautical miles of geometric adjustment executed in approximately 90 seconds. But it was the wrong bearing. The escort had repositioned to cover the bearing from which the intercept was not coming. The original southern approach bearing, the one the wingman was maintaining at reduced closure rate as a secondary presence. The escort had repositioned toward the secondary, not the primary. The flight lead was at 41 nautical miles from the lead H-6K when the escort repositioned. He was above and north on the approach vector he had adjusted to after identifying the escort's original coverage geometry. The escort's repositioning had not addressed his approach bearing. The formation's geometry was, at 4:46 a.m., less well organized against the actual intercept than it had been 5 minutes earlier. He closed to 22 nautical miles at 4:47 a.m. and began his descent toward the formation's altitude from the northern offset, the APG-77 picture showing all three contacts in detail. The lead, H-6K, filling his threat display with the specific radar return of an aircraft that was very large, very slow relative to his own airspeed, and absolutely unaware of what was now 22 nautical miles behind its left wing. The identification moment came at 4:49 a.m. when the flight lead's ATFLIR targeting pod resolved the lead H-6K visually at a range of 8 nautical miles in the pre-dawn light that was just beginning to distinguish the horizon from the Pacific below. The thermal image showed the H-6K's characteristic twin-engine nacelles under each wing, the distinctive mid-fuselage weapons bay, centerline hardpoints, and, visible as thermal contrasts against the cooler upper fuselage, 2 external store shapes mounted on the inboard wing pylons. He keyed his transmission at 4:49 a.m. and 22 seconds. AWACS, Raptor 1. Visual on lead contact. 2 external stores, inboard pylons, profile consistent with CJ-20. Confirm CJ-20 configuration. Request immediate relay to command. The AWACS relayed the transmission to Andersen Air Defense Command and to PACOM within 4 seconds. The CJ-20 configuration assessment reached PACOM's watch team at 4:49 a.m. and 31 seconds and activated the Theater Missile Defense Coordination Protocol, a series of notifications and readiness posture updates that moved through the integrated air defense network covering Guam and its surrounding waters in under 3 minutes. The flight lead was at 6 nautical miles from the lead H-6K when he activated his aircraft's identification systems and broadcast on the standard intercept frequency in both English and Mandarin. PLA Air Force aircraft, bearing 261 at 32,000 feet. This is United States Air Force intercepting aircraft. You are approaching restricted military airspace. Identify yourself, state your intentions, and reverse course immediately. This is your final advisory before defensive measures are taken. At 6 nautical miles, on a closing bearing, with his aircraft visible to the H-6K crew's own radar systems that were surely active in their long-range navigation mode, the transmission was not a question. It was a statement delivered by an aircraft that had been inside weapons employment range for 4 minutes without the bomber's crews knowing it, in the dark above the Pacific, at the edge of the Guam's defended perimeter. The lead H-6K responded at 4:50 a.m. and 11 seconds. The transmission was in Mandarin. The AWACS language specialist translated in real time and transmitted the English characterization to the flight lead and to Andersen simultaneously. The H-6K crew was identifying themselves as a People's Liberation Army Air Force training mission, conducting a long-range navigation exercise in international airspace. They stated they were aware of the approaching intercept aircraft and were confirming their non-threatening intentions. They were not altering course. Not altering course. The flight lead moved to a position alongside the lead H-6K's left wing, 2 nautical miles of lateral separation, matching its speed, his targeting pod providing continuous imagery of the external store's configuration for transmission to the intelligence analysis queue. The escort aircraft, now responding to the proximity of the Raptor it had apparently not been tracking, accelerated from its repositioned station and began closing toward the lead H-6K's position. The wingman's F-22, holding the southern approach bearing, was now directly in the escort's closing geometry. Not at a distance where the escort needed to decide, but present, acknowledged, a specific tactical fact that occupied a portion of the escort crew's attention and planning. At 4:52 a.m., the Air Defense Commander at Andersen transmitted to the flight lead. The transmission was brief, specific, and had been authorized through a staffing chain that had been running at PACOM level since the CJ-20 configuration assessment arrived. The H-6Ks were inside the outer boundary of the Integrated Air Defense System's primary engagement envelope. The CJ-20S they were carrying had a release range that the current position made technically possible. The H-6K crew had stated a training mission. They had not reversed course. The authorization was specific. The F-22 section was authorized to demonstrate active fire control radar illumination against the lead H-6K if the formation continued on its current heading past the 180 nautical mile marker from Andersen, currently 23 nautical miles ahead at the formation's current speed. Not weapons employment. Illumination. The specific electromagnetic statement that communicated, in language that radar warning receivers translated into unambiguous threat tones in a cockpit, that the aircraft flying alongside had made a decision. At 4:54 a.m., the lead H-6K had covered 21 of the 23 nautical miles. The flight lead activated his APG-77 in fire control mode at 4:54 a.m. and 12 seconds, 2 nautical miles before the authorized threshold, because the fire control mode's activation at that range would allow the H-6K's warning receivers to process the mode change and transmit the threat assessment to its crew with sufficient time to react before the threshold was crossed. The tone that activated in the H-6K crew's cockpits at 4:54 a.m. and 14 seconds was a specific one, not the relatively benign tone of a search radar, not the steady, medium priority tone of a long-range tracking system. The tone that an F-22's fire control radar produced in an adversary's warning receivers was the tone that every trained military aviator recognized as the sound of being inside someone else's weapons solution. The lead H-6K began its turn at 4:54 a.m. and 29 seconds, 15 seconds after the APG-77 activated in fire control mode. The turn was to the right, north, and it was gradual but committed, the large bomber beginning the wide arc that its mass and inertia required, swinging its nose away from the bearing that terminated at Andersen Air Force Base. The wingman H-6K followed the lead's turn, matching it in the formation geometry that both crews had been maintaining since 4:33 a.m. The escort aircraft, which had been accelerating toward the F-22 wingman's position, registered the bomber's turn and adjusted its own heading to maintain its position relative to the formation, the escort's fundamental role requiring it to stay with the platforms it was covering regardless of what those platforms did. All 3 contacts were turning north by 4:55 a.m. and 40 seconds. The flight lead held his formation position alongside the lead H-6K through the first 60 degrees of the turn, the APG-77 remaining in fire control mode, the targeting pod continuing to image the external store's configuration for the intelligence record. At 4:56 a.m., he broke off, climbed above the turning formation, and established a trail position that he maintained as the 3 contacts continued their turn onto a north-northwesterly heading that was carrying them back toward the Chinese mainland. He held the trail for 8 minutes, until the formation was at 140 nautical miles from Andersen, and the geometry of their track made a return to the intercept heading operationally implausible without another 40 minutes of flight time that would bring the formation back into the AWACS picture with sufficient warning for a second intercept. At 5:04 a.m., the Air Defense Commander at Andersen directed the F-22s to break off and return to base. The flight lead acknowledged, climbed to return altitude, and turned southeast toward Andersen. The contact's track on the AWACS picture continued northwest for the next hour and 40 minutes before the returns faded at the edge of effective detection range. They did not alter course again. They did not turn back. They continued toward the mainland on the heading they had taken when the fire control tone activated in their cockpits at 4:54 a.m. The mission debrief at Andersen began at 6:15 a.m. The intelligence value of the engagement was processed through the same dual-lens framework that had characterized every significant air intercept in this theater: operational outcome and intelligence collection. Operational outcome. The H-6K formation had turned back before reaching the 180 nautical mile threshold. Andersen's perimeter had been maintained. No cruise missile release had occurred. The integrated air defense system had not been required to transition beyond its current readiness posture. The two F-22s had returned with sufficient fuel for a second engagement sortie if one had been required. Intelligence collection. The ATFLIR imagery of the H-6K external stores configuration at 8 nautical miles in pre-dawn thermal conditions had produced a detailed assessment of the CJ-20 variant being carried, an assessment that the weapons analysts at the Intelligence Processing Center would spend the following 48 hours refining against the accumulated imagery database. The escort aircraft had been characterized at sufficient range and aspect angle to upgrade the confidence assessment from 71% to 94%. A J-16 variant in a configuration that included what appeared to be an active electronically scanned array radar pod on the center line station not previously documented in operational collection. The formation geometry, the ground station communication pattern, the escort's repositioning response to the F-22 wingman's secondary presence bearing, and the 15-second interval between fire control activation and turn initiation, all were documented, analyzed, and incorporated into the pre-mission intelligence package that would be briefed to the next alert crew. 15 seconds. The interval between the fire control tone and the turn decision in the lead H-6K's cockpit. 15 seconds measured how long the H-6K crew needed to process the mode change, assess the situation, consult with their mission parameters, and make the decision to reverse course. 15 seconds was fast. Faster than the previous documented turn initiation interval in comparable intercept scenarios against Chinese strategic bombers in this theater, which meant either the crew had been flying with a pre-briefed turn decision threshold that included fire control activation as a trigger, or the crew's individual decision cycle had produced a result faster than their predecessors in comparable situations. The intelligence officer writing the 15-second assessment in the debrief report spent 11 minutes on the precise language of that paragraph before arriving at a formulation that was accurate, actionable, and appropriately humble about what those 15 seconds could and could not tell an analyst about Chinese strategic bomber doctrine. Outside the debrief room, Andersen Air Force Base was running its morning operations in the clear Pacific light. The runway was active. The alert facility was already reconfigured for the next crew. The Pacific was the Pacific, an ocean that had been crossed by military aircraft on consequential missions since 1941, and that would continue to be crossed for as long as the geometry of the island it reached placed a runway at the precise point where strategic reach and strategic vulnerability occupied the same coordinates. The F-22 crews had defended those coordinates for 28 minutes at 32,000 feet over the western Pacific without firing a weapon, by being in the right place at the right time with the professional discipline to use the right capability at precisely the right moment. Guam was in the morning. The runway was open. The H-6Ks were 1,200 miles northwest and still going. That is what the 28 minutes of controlled, precisely calibrated aerial presence accomplishes in the geometry that defines this part of the world. A runway that opened in the morning because an intercept was completed in the dark. The watch continues. In the Pacific, it always does.